November 29, 1943, 4 miles above Germany, in the coldest and loneliest seat of a B-17 flying fortress, a 20-year-old tail gunner named Gene Moran scanned the sky behind his bomber and waited for the fighters he knew were coming. His plane was called Rikki Tikki Tavi, and it was one of more than 300 American bombers heading for Bremen, one of the most heavily defended industrial cities in the Reich. 10 minutes from the target, the intercom crackled with the words every crew dreaded. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The Germans had learned to attack the fortresses head-on because a fighter coming straight at the nose gave the American gunners almost no time to track it and almost nothing to shoot at. A formation of twin-engine Bf-110s bore straight into the bomber stream, and they carried something new under their wings. Heavy 21-centimeter mortar rockets designed to be fired into the tight American formations from beyond the range of their guns. The rockets streaked through the formation, and one of them flashed past the cockpit of Rikki Tikki Tavi, so close that the 21-year-old pilot, First Lieutenant Linwood Langley, barely had time to understand what had almost killed him. Somewhere in the formation, a fortress fell. Then the 110s closed in with their cannons, and the sky filled with tracer fire. As they roared past the bomber and peeled away in pairs, Gene caught them in his sights and hammered out bursts from his twin 50-caliber guns. When the attack faded, he squinted into the distance and saw small dots growing larger. There were more coming. Bf-109s, and the fighter the bomber crews feared most of all, the FW-190. The Americans called it the Butcher Bird. What followed was chaos. The world outside Gene's window became a storm of whirling fighters and burning tracers, and the floor of the bomber disappeared under piles of empty shell casings as every gun position fired at anything that moved. Then came the flak. Ahead of the formation, the sky filled with dirty black puffs of smoke as hundreds of German 88mm guns hurled shells up at the bombers. Most of the fighters peeled away from their own artillery, but some pressed their attacks straight through it. The fortresses flew on into the wall of fire, bucking and shuddering as the shells burst around them. Some were hit. From his seat in the tail, Gene watched bombers fall out of formation and drift down behind him, one after another. Over the target, the bomb bay doors of Rikki Tikki Tavi ground open, and Bombardier Donald Curtis waited for the lead plane to release. Then the bombs fell away, the plane lifted as the weight dropped clear, and Langley turned the formation for home. Slowly, mercifully, the flak petered out. The damage reports came in one by one, some holes in the wings and fuselage, but the crew was unhurt, all 4 engines were running strong, and relief flooded through the aircraft. They were going to make it. The words had barely died away when the gunners started shouting again. The fighters were back, and this time there were more of them than Gene had ever seen in the air at once. The entire box formation lit up the sky as the Germans tore through it from every direction. Fortresses went down in the melee, but the men of Rikki Tikki Tavi were too busy fighting to see them fall. Gene fired at a Butcher Bird as it flashed past, then a 109, never knowing if his bursts were finding their mark, only picking the next target and firing again. Then the plane shook under a heavy volley and something changed. Rikki Tikki Tavi began to slip backward out of the formation. Gene watched the gap between his tail and the other bombers grow wider and wider. He looked over both shoulders. No smoke from the engines, no fire, but the plane kept falling behind, and nobody on the intercom could explain why. The crew called for the captain. No answer came from the cockpit. A flying fortress inside its formation was protected by the guns of every bomber around it. A fortress alone was a death sentence, and every German pilot in the sky knew it. The fighters gathered around the straggler like wolves. The gunfire came from every angle now, and between the bursts, Gene could hear men screaming over the intercom. The plane still flew straight and level, but the voices answering the calls grew fewer and fewer. In the ball turret underneath the bomber hung Gene's best friend, Wilbert Provost. Everyone called him Pee-wee. His voice broke over the intercom, shouting that a fighter was climbing straight up at them from below, coming right up at the belly where the bomber was blindest. Then Gene heard the plexiglass of the ball turret shattering, and a scream, and then nothing. A twin-engine Messerschmitt climbed past the tail, right in front of Gene's guns. He held the triggers down and watched his rounds tear into it, and the fighter fell away trailing smoke. His best friend never spoke again. Then something strange happened. A Bf-109 slid up alongside the tail, close enough that Gene could see the pilot's face. Gene swung his guns toward it, but the German knew exactly where the tail guns could reach and held his fighter just outside the arc of fire. The two men locked eyes. Then the German pointed at Gene and pointed down at the ground. He did it again. Gene stared back and slowly understood what he was being offered. A chance to jump. A chance to live. The other fighters were circling in the distance, waiting, and this one pilot was holding them off long enough for the last man in a dying bomber to take to his parachute. Was he the last man? Had the rest of the crew already jumped? Or were they lying dead at their stations? Gene never got to decide. Somewhere forward in the bomber, another gun opened fire on the German. Someone else on Rikki Tikki Tavi was still alive and still fighting, and the fragile truce shattered in an instant. The 109 rolled away and was gone. And then the wolves came in to finish it. The tail of the bomber became a hailstorm of metal. Gene was thrown from his seat, dragged himself back up, and found his guns jammed. With shells tearing through the fuselage around him, he worked the mechanism with numb fingers until one gun came back to life. He got off a few more bursts. Then the bullets found him. Both of his arms were hit and broken. He kept firing anyway, forcing his shattered arms to work the gun until another burst slammed into his chest and broke his ribs. The tail position was now a ruin of torn metal and broken glass, and the bomber itself was dying. The nose dropped, and Gene felt himself pressed into his seat as Rikki Tikki Tavi began to plunge. His parachute had been shot to pieces. There was a spare stored near the tail wheel, just a few feet away, but with two broken arms and the plane accelerating downward, it might as well have been a mile. Then he heard a sound he would never forget. A deep, wrenching groan of tearing metal. The floor moved beneath him. Gene grabbed for anything he could hold as daylight ripped open in front of him, and he watched the entire fuselage of his bomber, with his crew inside, simply drop away and sink into the sky below. The tail had torn off, and Gene was still inside it. In the nose of the falling bomber, navigator Jesse Orison was fighting his own battle. Bombardier Curtis had been hit and thrown back into him, and Orison wrestled a parachute onto his friend's limp body just before the plexiglass nose exploded around them. Orison was hurled out of the plane through the broken glass. It sliced deep into his legs as he fell, and he pulled his ripcord, screaming with pain. Hanging under his parachute, he saw the severed tail of Rikki Tikki Tavi spinning down through the sky, its rudder and elevators fluttering as it fell. He had no idea his friend was still inside it. At least 3 eyewitnesses watched the tail fall that day. Some later swore the tail gunner kept firing his guns all the way down. Gene himself always said that was a legend. The truth was worse. Inside the tail, the spin pinned him in place like a giant hand. He could not move. He could not reach the spare parachute. Blood ran into his eyes until the world turned red, and the tail fell and kept falling and kept falling. 4 miles, with no parachute, trapped in a spinning piece of wreckage. The fall seemed to last forever. Then the tail slammed into a forest with a violence no man was meant to survive. Gene survived it. He woke in the wreckage, half blind, and saw light at the end of a tunnel of torn metal. He crawled toward it, over broken glass and jagged aluminum, with 2 broken arms and broken ribs and his teeth loose in his jaw. Then he fell, one last time, a few feet down onto the forest floor. Above him, hanging in the trees, was the tail of Rikki Tikki Tavi. He lay there, shattered and alive, and when he carefully reached up to his head, he found a crack in his skull so wide that he could feel the softness of his own brain between the edges of the bone. Then he heard voices coming through the trees, and his stomach turned to ice. Bomber crews who parachuted into Germany were sometimes beaten to death by the civilians they had just bombed. But the voices were speaking French. Forced laborers from a nearby camp reached him first, with German soldiers close behind, and all of them stopped and stared. They had come looking for a body to bury, and instead they found a man blinking up at them from beneath the tail he had fallen with. Gene was dragged out of the forest and taken to a camp where a Serbian prisoner of war, a surgeon, operated on his head and closed the hole in his skull with a metal plate. His body slowly healed. The nights were harder. In the prisoner of war hospital, Gene woke again and again from the same nightmare. He was always falling. He survived captivity, and when the war ended, he was freed and sent home. Of the 10 men aboard Rikki Tikki Tavi, only one other had survived. The navigator Jesse Orison, the man who had watched the tail fall without knowing what it carried. The two remained friends for the rest of their lives. For decades, Gene Moran rarely spoke about that day over Bremen. When he tried, the memories of his crew often stopped him before the words came. He died in 2014, and 8 years later, a close friend, John Armbruster, finally told the whole story in a book called Tailspin, built from years of conversations with the man who fell. Because that was the hardest part of Gene Moran's story, not the falling, the believing. He fell 4 miles inside the severed tail of a bomber with no parachute, through a sky full of enemies, into a forest in Germany. And he lived to be an old man.